Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. If you're here at 2 a.m. scrolling through YouTube instead of sleeping, or maybe you're doing dishes while wondering why humans can't seem to stop hurting each other, you've found the right corner of the internet. This is where we take the big, messy questions about our species and break them down slowly, carefully, without the drama or clickbait, just deep time, real science, and the strange story of how we got here. Tonight's question is deceptively simple. When did we start killing each other? Not individual murder, not random violence, but organised, systematic conflict. When did raids become battles? When did feuds become wars? When did humans stop being opportunistic aggressors and start being strategic ones? If this kind of slow burn historical storytelling helps you focus, unwind, or just feel less alone with your thoughts, I'd appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed. It genuinely helps more people find this type of content in a world that's usually screaming for your attention. And hey, if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, don't worry. I've put timestamps in the description so you can pick up where you left off tomorrow. This story is worth hearing all the way through. What we're exploring today isn't the history of famous battles or legendary warriors. This is the deeper story. The archaeological story, the one written in broken bones, abandoned villages, and walls that shouldn't exist yet. We're going back 500,000 years to trace the slow, uneven evolution of human violence, from isolated incidents to institutional systems. So settle in, turn down the lights if you want, and let's begin at the very beginning, in a world where the word war hadn't been invented yet, but the capacity for it was quietly taking shape. Before war, the architecture of violence. To understand when war began, we first need to understand what came before it, because violence itself is ancient, far older than humans, older than language, older than the ability to plan beyond tomorrow's meal. But there's a difference between violence and war. A chasm, really. And somewhere in that chasm lies one of the most important transitions in human history. Let's start with our closest relatives. In the forests of East and Central Africa, wild chimpanzees engage in behaviours that feel uncomfortably familiar. Not the gentle, tool-using chimps of nature documentaries, but the territorial ones. The strategic ones. Groups of males patrol their borders, moving silently through the forest. When they encounter a lone individual from a neighbouring community, they don't negotiate, they attack. These aren't spontaneous outbursts of aggression, they're coordinated, planned. One group will venture into rival territory, sometimes travelling for hours, moving quietly until they find an isolated target. Then they strike with overwhelming force. No food is taken, no immediate resources claimed. The only goal seems to be elimination. Jane Goodall first documented this behaviour in the 1970s, and it shattered our comfortable assumptions about nature's innocence. In Uganda's Kibale National Park, researchers tracked one community of chimpanzees as they systematically eliminated males from a neighbouring group over the course of more than a decade. It wasn't random, it was methodical, and when it was over, the victorious group had expanded their territory, gained access to new fruit trees, and absorbed some of the females from the defeated community. This behaviour has a name in primatology, coalitionary aggression, and it's not limited to chimpanzees. Bonobos, our other close relatives, rarely engage in lethal violence, but they do form alliances, exclude outsiders, and engage in competitive displays. The capacity for group-based aggression, it seems, runs deep in our evolutionary lineage. But here's where it gets interesting. Coalitionary aggression in chimpanzees has limits. It's opportunistic, not systematic. It relies on encountering isolated individuals, and it's constrained by the fact that chimps can't plan very far ahead or coordinate very large groups. Their wars, if we can call them that, are more like extended feuds. Now imagine those same impulses in a species with larger brains, better communication, and the ability to make tools. Imagine them in early human ancestors who could plan, remember, and hold grudges across seasons. Suddenly the rules change. The earliest evidence of potential violence in human ancestors is frustratingly sparse. We're dealing with fossils that are millions of years old, most of them fragmentary, weathered, and difficult to interpret. A cracked skull here, a healed fracture there, nothing definitive, nothing that screams murder. But enough to suggest that interpersonal violence was part of the landscape. Take the Swartkrans cave in South Africa. Among the fossilised remains of early hominins, some dating back nearly 2 million years, researchers have found evidence of trauma. Puncture wounds in skulls that might have been caused by the teeth of large carnivores. But some of the damage patterns don't quite fit. The angles are wrong. The force seems too focused. A few researchers have suggested that some of these wounds might have been inflicted by other hominins using tools. It's speculative, it's debated, and it's exactly the kind of evidence that makes studying prehistoric violence so maddening, because bones can lie. Time erases context, and the line between accident, predation, and intentional harm gets blurred across millennia. But let's assume for a moment that early human ancestors did occasionally kill each other. What would that violence have looked like? Certainly nothing resembling war. No armies, no strategies, no territorial campaigns. More likely it would have been intimate, personal, a dispute over food, a challenge to dominance, a moment of rage that went too far. The key difference between this hypothetical early violence and what we see in chimpanzees is tools. By 2 million years ago, human ancestors were already making and using stone implements. Simple ones, flakes and choppers, but sharp enough to change the equation. A rock becomes more dangerous when it's deliberately shaped. A stick becomes a weapon when it's sharpened. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing sophistication in tool-making. The Oldowan tradition, named after discoveries at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, represents some of the earliest known stone technologies. These weren't weapons in any obvious sense. They were used for processing carcasses, cracking bones for marrow, cutting plant materials. But the cognitive leap required to make them is significant. Someone had to understand that a stone could be modified to serve a purpose. That force could be amplified through technology. And once that understanding exists, it's only a matter of time before someone realizes that the same tool that can butcher an antelope can also harm a rival. The archaeological record from this period is maddeningly silent on organised conflict. We don't see mass graves, defensive structures, or clear evidence of group versus group violence, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. Early human societies were small, mobile, and left light footprints. Most violence would have been small-scale and unlikely to leave clear archaeological signatures. What we do see are hints, tool assemblages that suggest planning and coordination, evidence of controlled fire use, which implies social cooperation, but also the ability to exclude others from the circle of warmth and light, increasing brain size, which suggests growing cognitive complexity, and potentially the ability to hold more complex social relationships, including antagonistic ones. By around 500,000 years ago, something had definitely shifted. Homo erectus had spread across Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. Brain sizes were approaching modern ranges. Tool-making had become more sophisticated, with evidence of wooden spears and possibly hafted implements. And perhaps most importantly, there were now multiple human species sharing the same landscapes. Competition between different human groups, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and others, would have been inevitable. Not necessarily violent competition, but certainly ecological pressure. When two similar species occupy the same niche, something has to give. Usually, one outcompetes the other through superior adaptation, better tools, or more effective social organisation. But sometimes, competition becomes conflict, and when it does, the species with better weapons, better coordination, or simply more willingness to use violence has an advantage. The Levant, the narrow corridor of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, provides some of our earliest glimpses of this dynamic. Archaeological sites in Israel and Palestine show alternating occupation by different human groups over tens of thousands of years. First Neanderthals, then early Homo sapiens, then Neanderthals again. Back and forth, like a slow-motion territorial dispute played out across geological time. Did these groups fight each other directly? The evidence is ambiguous. What we see instead are patterns of replacement, periods when one type of human disappears from the archaeological record and another takes their place. It could have been climate change, it could have been disease, or it could have been something more direct. One tantalizing piece of evidence comes from the site of Kesem Cave in Israel. Among the remains of early humans dating to around 400,000 years ago, researchers found a skull fragment with what appears to be a healed depression fracture, the kind of injury that might result from a blow to the head. It's not proof of violence, but it's suggestive. Someone was hurt badly and somehow survived. What makes this period so crucial in the story of human violence is not just that weapons were becoming more sophisticated, but that social structures were becoming more complex. Larger group sizes meant more potential for internal conflict, but also more capacity for coordination. Language was likely developing, which meant the ability to plan, coordinate, and remember grievances across longer periods. Fire use was becoming widespread, creating central gathering points that could serve as both unifying forces and targets for attack. The control of fire represented a new kind of power, the ability to extend the day, cook food more efficiently, and create zones of safety in an otherwise dangerous world. But it also created something to defend and something to covet. By the end of this period, around 300,000 years ago, the stage was set for something new. Not war in any modern sense, but the preconditions for it. Humans had the tools, the social organisation, and increasingly the motivation to engage in systematic group-based violence. What was missing was scale, the leap from occasional raids to sustained campaigns, from personal vendettas to territorial conquest, from violence as a tool of last resort to violence as a means of advancement. That leap would come later, much later, but its foundations were being laid in the growing sophistication of human societies, the increasing competition for resources, and perhaps most importantly, in the developing human capacity to see other groups, not as potential allies or trading partners, but as threats to be eliminated. The story of war, it turns out, doesn't begin with armies clashing on battlefields. It begins with small groups of humans learning to coordinate their aggression, to plan their attacks, and to remember their enemies. It begins with the slow realization that violence could be more than reactive, it could be strategic. And once that realization took hold, everything else would follow. The first murders, reading violence in stone and bone. Around 300,000 years ago, something changed in the human relationship with death. Not natural death, that had always been part of life, but deliberate death, the kind that leaves marks in bone that time can't erase. In the limestone caves of northern Spain, at a site called Cima de los Huesos, researchers uncovered one of the most haunting pieces of evidence for early human violence. Among the remains of at least 28 individuals, dating back over 400,000 years, one skull tells a particularly dark story. Known simply as Cranium 17, it bears two closely spaced fractures to the frontal bone. Both wounds were inflicted around the time of death. Both appear to have been made by the same implement, possibly a stone hand axe. Someone hit this person twice in the head, hard enough to crack the skull, close enough to look them in the face while doing it. This wasn't hunting. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, preserved in calcium phosphate and silence. But Cranium 17 raises more questions than it answers. Who was this person? Why were they killed? And perhaps most intriguingly, why were they buried with such apparent care alongside 27 others in a deep cave shaft that could only be reached through a complex underground passage. The Cima de los Huesos site suggests something profound about early human psychology. These people didn't just kill, they remembered. They honoured their dead, even the ones who died violently. The act of carrying bodies deep into the earth, of placing them together in what amounts to humanity's first cemetery, speaks to a level of ritual sophistication we rarely associate with our ancient ancestors. But it also speaks to something darker, because if you're going to the trouble of creating elaborate burial practices, it probably means death, including violent death, had become common enough to require formal procedures. Fast forward to around 100,000 years ago, and the evidence becomes more frequent, more varied, and more troubling. At Jebel Kafse in Israel, among the remains of early Homo sapiens, researchers found a young adult with a spear point embedded in the femur. The individual survived long enough for the bone to begin healing around the foreign object, but the injury would have been debilitating. Someone who couldn't run, couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't contribute to group defense. In prehistoric societies with no social safety nets, such an injury would have been a death sentence unless the community chose to support the wounded person. The fact that this individual survived suggests either remarkable luck or remarkable compassion, but it also suggests that spear wounds were becoming familiar enough that people knew how to treat them. The weapons themselves were evolving too. By 200,000 years ago, wooden spears had become longer, straighter, and more carefully balanced. The famous Schöningen spears from Germany, dating to around 300,000 years ago, were over 2 meters long and aerodynamically designed for throwing. These weren't crude sticks sharpened in desperation. They were engineered projectiles, crafted with the same attention to detail as modern javelins. And if you can throw a spear accurately enough to bring down a horse, which the Schöningen hunters clearly could, you can certainly use the same weapon against another human. The psychological implications of projectile weapons can't be overstated. For the first time in evolutionary history, it became possible to kill at a distance. You no longer had to get close enough to smell your victim's fear, to look into their eyes, to risk being grabbed or bitten in return. Violence became cleaner, safer, and paradoxically more terrible. Distance creates detachment, and detachment makes violence easier. Archaeological sites from this period begin to show other troubling patterns. Defensive positioning of settlements, with camps placed on elevated ground or near escape routes. Evidence of rapid abandonment, with valuable tools and food stores left behind. Signs that people were living with the constant possibility of attack. At the Claisies River caves in South Africa, layers dating to around 90,000 years ago contain human remains with cut marks that don't match typical butchery patterns. The cuts are in the wrong places, made at the wrong angles. Some researchers have suggested these might be evidence of cannibalism, not survival cannibalism driven by starvation, but something more ritualistic. The systematic processing of enemy dead. It's a horrifying possibility, but one that fits with what we know about human psychology. Once you've dehumanized your enemies enough to kill them systematically, other taboos become easier to break. The line between legitimate target and food source begins to blur, but we need to be careful not to paint this entire period as a bloodbath. Most human remains from this era show no signs of violence. Most sites contain no evidence of conflict. The vast majority of our ancestors lived and died peacefully, concerned more with finding food and raising children than with warfare. What's significant is that violence, when it occurred, was becoming more sophisticated, more planned, more group-oriented. Take the pattern of injuries found at various sites across Africa and the Middle East. Head trauma, yes, but also defensive wounds on the forearms and hands. The kind of injuries you get when you raise your arms to protect yourself from a blow. Projectile points embedded in bones, but not randomly distributed. They cluster around vulnerable areas: the chest, the abdomen, the neck. Someone was learning anatomy. Someone was teaching others where to aim for maximum effect. The social implications are staggering. For violence to become this systematic, it had to be transmitted culturally. Young people had to be taught not just how to make weapons, but how to use them effectively against other humans. Knowledge that had once been focused on hunting animals was being adapted for hunting people. And once that knowledge existed, it created its own momentum. Groups that were better at violence had advantages over those that weren't. Not necessarily in direct confrontation, but in the ability to claim better territories, secure more resources, and intimidate rivals into submission. Natural selection, which had shaped human cooperation for millions of years, began to favour a different set of traits. Not just the ability to work together within the group, but the ability to coordinate against outsiders. Not just empathy and altruism, but the capacity to switch those qualities off when dealing with enemies. By 50,000 years ago, as anatomically modern humans began spreading out of Africa and into the wider world, they carried this dual legacy with them. The capacity for unprecedented cooperation within their communities, combined with an increasingly sophisticated toolkit for violence against those outside their communities. It was a potent combination, and it would reshape not just human societies, but the entire planet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before violence could become truly systematic, before it could become war in any recognizable sense, humans had to solve several practical problems. How do you coordinate attacks across multiple groups? How do you maintain loyalty during extended campaigns? How do you distinguish friend from foe in the chaos of battle? The answers to these questions would emerge slowly over tens of thousands of years. But their foundations were being laid in this period of increasing sophistication and growing lethality. What we're witnessing in the archaeological record of 300,000 to 50,000 years ago isn't the invention of war. It's the invention of the preconditions that would make war possible. The tools, the techniques, the social structures, and perhaps most importantly, the mindset that could transform occasional violence into systematic slaughter. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species capable of coordinating lethal force on an industrial scale, but first they had to learn to see each other as enemies worth killing, and that lesson was about to become very, very thorough. The invention of the enemy, when symbols became weapons. Somewhere between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago, humans began doing something that would change everything. We started decorating ourselves, not for warmth, not for protection, but for meaning. Shell beads strung around necks, red ochre ground into powder and smeared across skin. Geometric patterns etched into bone and stone. At first glance, these seem like harmless expressions of creativity, but they were actually something far more dangerous, the birth of identity. And once humans could signal who they were, they could also signal who they weren't. In the limestone caves of Blombos in South Africa, archaeologists found some of humanity's earliest jewellery, tiny Nassarius shells, carefully perforated and worn smooth by use, dating back at least 75,000 years. Some still carried traces of red ochre, suggesting they were deliberately coloured before being worn. These weren't casual ornaments, they were statements, but statements about what? The shells had to be collected from coastal areas and transported inland. The ochre had to be mined, ground, and mixed. Someone spent considerable time and effort creating these objects, and others spent time and effort wearing them. That level of investment suggests meaning, deep, shared cultural meaning. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have found that personal ornamentation almost always serves as a form of social signalling. Beads indicate tribal affiliation, face paint marks ritual status, scarification shows initiation into adulthood. The specific patterns, colours, and materials aren't random. They're codes that instantly communicate who belongs and who doesn't. If the same was true 75,000 years ago, then these early humans weren't just creating art. They were creating the first us versus them distinctions that could be read at a glance. The implications are staggering. For most of human evolution, group membership would have been obvious. You knew everyone in your band of 20 or 30 people. You recognized their faces, their voices, their personal histories. But as populations grew and groups began encountering strangers more frequently, that intimate knowledge became insufficient. Symbolic markers solved this problem elegantly. A particular style of bead or a specific pattern of ochre could instantly identify friend or foe, even at a distance. But it also created new categories of conflict. Now you could be killed not just for what you had done, but for what you represented. Not just for personal grievances, but for wearing the wrong symbols. The archaeological record from this period shows these symbolic systems spreading rapidly across Africa and, eventually, into Asia and Europe. Similar beads appear at sites thousands of kilometers apart. Ochre processing becomes widespread. Geometric engravings start appearing on cave walls and portable objects. But here's what's unsettling. The symbolic systems weren't universal. Different regions developed different styles, different colours, different meanings. The beads that marked you as a friend in one valley might mark you as an enemy in the next. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, researchers found evidence of what might be the world's first fashion trend. Over several thousand years, the style of beads changed in synchronized waves across multiple sites. Old patterns were abandoned, new ones adopted, all within relatively short time periods. It's exactly what you'd expect if groups were using material culture to maintain social boundaries and coordinate group identity. But fashion trends require communication networks. Information has to flow between groups for styles to spread and change in coordinated ways. That means contact, trade, and cultural exchange. Paradoxically, the same networks that spread symbolic unity within groups also created the infrastructure for symbolic division between them. By 50,000 years ago, as modern humans began their final exodus from Africa, they carried these symbolic systems with them. Cave paintings in Indonesia show the same concern with group identity and marking territory. Rock art in Europe depicts humans in ceremonial dress, often carrying weapons and facing off against others who look distinctly different. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet, dating to around 30,000 years ago, are dominated by animals. But when humans do appear, they're often stylized and symbolic rather than realistic. They're wearing headdresses, carrying spears, engaged in activities that look suspiciously like warfare or ritual combat. Even more tellingly, some of the earliest representational art shows violence explicitly. In the rock shelters of eastern Spain, painted figures with bows and arrows face off in what can only be described as battle scenes. These aren't hunting scenes, the targets are clearly human. Some figures lie on the ground, with arrows protruding from their bodies. Others flee or advance in formation. These paintings date to around 10,000 years ago, but they represent the culmination of a much longer process. The artistic tradition, the symbolic vocabulary, the very concept of depicting human conflict, all of these had deep roots in the earlier development of group identity markers. What we're seeing in the archaeological record of this period is the cognitive revolution that made systematic warfare possible. Not the invention of better weapons, though those were important too, but the invention of better reasons to use them. Once humans could conceive of themselves as members of distinct, bounded groups, violence was no longer just personal, it became political. You could kill someone not because they had wronged you individually, but because they belonged to the wrong group, wore the wrong symbols, came from the wrong place. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this shift are still with us today. Social psychologists have demonstrated that humans have an almost automatic tendency to favour their own group and discriminate against outsiders. Show people arbitrary symbols, coloured badges, geometric shapes, random numbers, and within minutes they'll develop preferences for their own team and suspicions about others. This isn't conscious malice, it's cognitive architecture that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of group living. The ability to quickly identify allies and potential threats was essential for survival in a world where cooperation within the group meant life and conflict between groups meant death. But like many evolved psychological mechanisms, in-group favoritism comes with built-in biases that can be exploited and amplified. The same mental processes that help you bond with your family can be redirected toward your tribe, your nation, your ideology. The same impulses that make you protective of your children can make you hostile toward anyone who threatens your group's interests. The archaeological record suggests this amplification was already happening by 50,000 years ago. Group identity markers weren't just becoming more elaborate, they were becoming more exclusive. Regional styles became more distinct, not less. Cultural boundaries became sharper, not fuzzier. This pattern accelerates dramatically as we move toward the Neolithic period. By 10,000 years ago, human societies had developed not just complex symbol systems, but the beginning of what we might recognize as ideology, shared belief systems that justified violence against outsiders and demanded loyalty from insiders. The cave paintings of this later period don't just show individual combat, they show organized groups as coordinated movements, what looks suspiciously like military formations. The symbolic has become strategic, but we're still not quite at war in the modern sense. These are still small-scale societies, probably numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands. The violence, while more organized than before, is still episodic and localized. What's missing is sustainability, the ability to maintain large-scale conflict over extended periods, the logistical systems that could support armies in the field, the social hierarchies that could coordinate complex military campaigns. Those innovations were coming, but they would require something that didn't yet exist: permanent settlements, agricultural surplus, and the concentration of power in the hands of specialized elites. The symbolic revolution had created the ideological foundations for warfare, but building an actual war machine would require much more than symbols and stories. It would require cities, states, and the systematic organization of violence as a tool of political control. That transformation was about to begin, and when it did, the small-scale raids and symbolic conflicts of the prehistoric world would seem almost quaint by comparison, because once humans learned to wage war systematically, they would never quite remember how to stop. The architecture of fear, how settlements became fortresses. By 15,000 years ago, something fundamental had shifted in the human relationship with space. For over 2 million years, our ancestors had been nomads, moving with the seasons, following herds, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. But as the last ice age ended and the world warmed, some groups began to linger. They built more permanent shelters. They stored food for longer periods. They buried their dead in the same places their grandparents had been buried. And then they started building walls. The transition to settled life, what archaeologists call sedentism, wasn't a sudden revolution. It happened gradually, unevenly, in response to local conditions and opportunities. In the fertile valleys of the Near East, wild grains grew thick enough to support year-round harvesting. Along major rivers, fish runs were predictable enough to justify permanent fishing stations. In areas with reliable springs, the water itself became an anchor point for increasingly stable communities, but permanence created new vulnerabilities. A mobile band that lost a fight could disappear into the landscape, regroup elsewhere, start over. A settled community had nowhere to run. Their granaries, their tools, their children, everything was fixed in place, waiting for someone to come and take it. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of growing anxiety. At Tel Es-Sowan in Iraq, dating to around 6000 BCE, excavators found something unprecedented. A village surrounded by a defensive ditch nearly 3 meters deep and 4 meters wide. Inside the perimeter, houses were packed tightly together, their walls shared for maximum efficiency and minimum vulnerability. This wasn't flood control. The ditch was too precisely engineered, too strategically positioned. Someone had spent enormous amounts of labour creating a barrier specifically designed to slow down human attackers. But who were they afraid of? The site shows no evidence of actual battles, no mass graves or destruction layers. The threat, it seems, was more psychological than immediate. The mere possibility of attack had become real enough to reshape how people lived. Similar patterns appear across the Fertile Crescent during this period. At Jericho, yes, that Jericho, archaeologists found evidence of massive fortifications dating back nearly 10,000 years. A stone wall over 3 meters high, backed by a tower that must have required coordinated labour from hundreds of people. The engineering was sophisticated, the construction was deliberate, and the message was clear. This place is defended. What makes these early fortifications so significant isn't just their existence, but their timing. They appear before large-scale agriculture, before complex social hierarchies, before any of the traditional markers of civilization. People were building defences before they had much worth defending, at least in material terms. That suggests the walls weren't just about protecting resources, they were about protecting identity, community, the accumulated investment of generations who had chosen to stay in one place. Once you've buried your ancestors somewhere, once you've shaped the landscape to suit your needs, once you've built something permanent, it becomes part of who you are, and losing it becomes unthinkable. The psychology of territory runs deep in human nature, but sedentism amplified it dramatically. Mobile hunter-gatherers might fight over temporary resources, a particularly rich hunting ground, a seasonal fruit grove, access to water during a drought, but the fights would be short-term, opportunistic. Once the resource was depleted or the season changed, the conflict would naturally resolve itself. Settled communities created a new kind of scarcity, location scarcity. The best spots near reliable water, on fertile soil, along trade routes, were limited. Once claimed and developed, they became increasingly valuable and increasingly worth fighting over. The defensive innovations spread rapidly across the early Neolithic world. In Anatolia, sites like Çatalhöyük took a different approach to the same problem. Instead of building walls around their settlements, they eliminated external access entirely. Houses were built wall-to-wall in dense clusters, with entry only through roof hatches. The entire settlement became a fortress, its perimeter formed by the outer walls of individual homes. Walking through Çatalhöyük would have been like moving through a maze of rooftops, climbing ladders to visit neighbours, descending through ceiling holes to reach interior spaces. It was architecturally ingenious and socially claustrophobic, exactly what you'd expect from a community that had decided security was more important than convenience. But the most telling aspect of these early fortifications isn't their sophistication, it's their failure rate. Many of the sites that show evidence of defensive construction also show evidence of destruction. Burned buildings, scattered human remains, layers of ash that speak to sudden catastrophic violence. At Schletz in Austria, excavators found the remains of over 200 individuals dumped into the defensive ditch that was supposed to protect them. Men, women, children, entire families killed and discarded like refuse. The settlement had been overrun despite its fortifications, its population slaughtered or carried off. Similar massacre sites appear across Central Europe during this period. Talheim in Germany, Aspern in Austria, Herxheim with its horrific deposits of processed human bones. These weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic, coordinated attacks on settled communities by groups that had the numbers, organisation, and motivation to overwhelm defensive positions. The pattern suggests an arms race between defensive and offensive capabilities. Communities built walls, so attackers developed tactics for breaching them. Settlements clustered their houses, so raiders learned to use fire as a weapon, forcing defenders into the open. Defense inspired counter-defense, which inspired counter-counter-defense, in an escalating spiral of military innovation. But who were the attackers? In many cases, they seem to have been other settled communities. The massacre victims at these sites often show isotopic signatures, suggesting they were locals, people who had grown up in the region. Their killers weren't foreign invaders, but neighbours, perhaps from the next valley over, perhaps from communities that had been displaced by climate change or population pressure. This is where the story of human warfare takes a crucial turn. Violence was no longer just between mobile bands competing for temporary resources. It was between established communities fighting for permanent territorial control. The stakes had risen dramatically, and so had the scale of violence required to resolve disputes. The archaeological evidence suggests these conflicts weren't always total war. Many sites show periods of abandonment, followed by reoccupation, sometimes by the same cultural groups that had been driven out. People fled, regrouped, returned when the threat had passed. Communities might be burned, but they could be rebuilt. Populations might be scattered, but they could reassemble. But some conflicts did end in complete elimination. The genetic record from this period shows dramatic population bottlenecks in certain regions, entire lineages disappearing from the archaeological record. When whole communities were wiped out, their cultural knowledge, their technological innovations, their accumulated wisdom died with them. This represents a new kind of human tragedy. For millions of years, violence had been personal, limited in scope. Even the worst conflicts would affect only small numbers of people. But the combination of settled life, territorial thinking, and improved weapons technology had created the possibility of something unprecedented: the complete destruction of entire communities. The psychological impact must have been enormous. People living in early Neolithic settlements would have grown up with stories of massacres, of communities that had vanished overnight, of walls that hadn't been strong enough to keep the darkness out. Fear would have been a constant companion, shaping daily decisions about where to build, how to organise, whom to trust. This fear left its mark in the archaeological record in subtle but persistent ways. Settlement locations chosen for defensibility rather than convenience, house layouts optimised for rapid evacuation, tool assemblages that include an unusually high proportion of weapons alongside the usual domestic implements. But perhaps most significantly, this period sees the emergence of what we might call military architecture, construction designed not just to shelter or store, but to kill, arrow slits in walls, killing fields in front of gates, choke points that would funnel attackers into predetermined zones where defenders could concentrate their fire. The people who built these features weren't soldiers in any modern sense. They were farmers, herders, crafters who had been forced by circumstances to think like tacticians. But their innovations would form the foundation of military engineering for thousands of years to come. By 8,000 years ago, the basic template of fortified settlement warfare had been established. Communities would cluster around defensible positions. They would invest enormous labour in protective infrastructure. They would train their members in combat techniques. And when diplomacy failed, they would attempt to overwhelm their neighbours' defences through coordinated assault. It wasn't war in the sense of organised campaigns or professional armies, but it was systematic, strategic violence aimed at territorial control, and it was sustainable in a way that earlier forms of conflict had never been. Communities could maintain defensive postures for generations, passing military knowledge and territorial grudges down through family lines. The stage was set for something larger, Once humans had learned to organize violence at the community level, it was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to coordinate multiple communities for larger campaigns. The next step would be the emergence of military leadership, specialized roles for people whose primary job was planning and directing violence. And once that happened, the small-scale territorial conflicts of the early Neolithic would begin to look like practice rounds for the real thing. The birth of the raid, when violence became strategic. Around 9,000 years ago, something shifted in the human calculus of violence. For the first time in our species' history, people began to realize that attacking others could be more profitable than trading with them. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough to change the fundamental economics of human interaction. This wasn't the spontaneous violence of earlier periods, the personal grudges, the territorial disputes, the moments when cooperation broke down into bloodshed. This was different. This was planned, coordinated, and most importantly, it was profitable. The archaeological record from this period tells a story that's both fascinating and disturbing. Across the highlands of Anatolia, the river valleys of Mesopotamia, and the coastal plains of the Levant, we begin to see evidence of a new kind of violence, not the desperate last stands of communities under siege, but the organized extraction of wealth through force. The key innovation was mobility. While most communities were becoming increasingly sedentary, investing in permanent structures and defensive walls, some groups were learning to exploit that very immobility. They remained mobile, traveling light, striking fast, and disappearing before organized retaliation could be mounted. These early raiders faced a fundamental logistical problem. How do you sustain a mobile lifestyle while also accumulating enough resources to make raiding worthwhile? The answer lay in livestock. Domesticated animals, goats, sheep, and eventually cattle, represented a revolutionary form of wealth. They were mobile, self-reproducing, and convertible. You could eat them, milk them, trade them, or use them to buy allies. But livestock also created new vulnerabilities. Animals could be stolen more easily than grain stores. They left tracks, they made noise, they needed water and pasture, which made their owners predictable in their movements. A successful raid could transfer months or years of accumulated wealth in a single night. The earliest evidence for systematic livestock raiding comes from sites across the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Around 8,500 years ago, pastoral communities in this region began showing signs of increasing militarization. Not the defensive postures we saw in earlier settlements, but offensive capabilities, weapons caches that were too large for hunting, tool assemblages optimized for mobility rather than permanence, settlement patterns that suggested rapid movement and temporary occupation. More tellingly, we begin to see changes in animal bone assemblages at archaeological sites. The age profiles of domesticated herds start to look unnatural. Too many young animals, not enough breeding stock. It's exactly what you'd expect if communities were regularly losing portions of their herds to raiders and struggling to maintain sustainable breeding populations. But raiding wasn't just about stealing animals, it was about stealing people. The demographic patterns in burial sites from this period show something troubling, a systematic absence of young women and children from communities that show other signs of violent disruption. They weren't being killed, at least not in large numbers, they were being taken. Captive taking represents another crucial escalation in the organization of violence. It requires more planning than simple theft, more coordination than opportunistic raiding. You need to be able to control prisoners during transport, integrate them into your own community, and manage the social disruption that comes with forced population transfers. But it also offers greater rewards. Captives represent labor, reproductive potential, and specialized knowledge. A skilled potter or metal worker captured from a neighboring community could upgrade your entire technological base. Young women could be integrated through marriage, expanding your gene pool while simultaneously weakening your enemy's demographic future. The social implications of systematic captive taking are staggering. It meant that every interaction with strangers carried the risk not just of death, but of enslavement. Parents had to worry not just about protecting their children from predators, but from other humans who might see them as resources to be acquired. This period also sees the emergence of what we might call the warrior identity. Not everyone in these early raiding societies was a combatant, but those who began to develop distinct cultural markers, specialized weapons that were too elaborate for hunting, grave goods that emphasized martial prowess over productive skills, evidence of deliberate body modification, scarification, dental alteration, cranial shaping, that marked individuals as members of warrior classes. At sites like Domuztepe in southeastern Turkey, excavators found burials that tell a complex story about violence and status. Some individuals were interred with elaborate weapon sets, multiple spear points, stone mace heads, obsidian daggers. But these weren't just tools, they were works of art, crafted with a level of skill and decoration that went far beyond functional requirements. The message was clear: violence had become prestigious. The ability to take wealth from others through force was being celebrated, ritualized, and passed down through generations as a legitimate way of life. But raiding societies faced their own internal tensions. Success in warfare required qualities that could be disruptive to social cohesion: aggression, competitiveness, willingness to take risks. These traits were valuable in combat, but potentially dangerous in peacetime. How do you maintain a warrior class without having them turn on each other when external targets become scarce? The answer seems to have been ritualization. Violence became channeled through formal structures, ceremonial contexts that allowed for the expression of aggression while maintaining social order. Evidence from this period includes what appear to be formalized combat arenas, spaces specifically designed for ritualized fighting between individuals or small groups. These weren't gladiatorial spectacles in the Roman sense, but they served similar functions. They provided outlets for competitive violence, ways to settle disputes without destroying community cohesion, and perhaps most importantly, training grounds where young warriors could develop skills without the lethal consequences of real raids. The development of ritualized violence also suggests something crucial about human psychology during this period. People were becoming conscious of violence as a distinct category of human behavior. It wasn't just something that happened. It was something that could be managed, directed, and optimized. This meta-awareness of violence, the ability to think about fighting as a skill set rather than just an emotional response, represents a cognitive revolution comparable to the development of agriculture or metallurgy. Once humans could analyze violence objectively, they could improve it systematically. The archaeological record from around 7,000 years ago shows clear evidence of this systematic improvement. Weapon designs become more standardized, suggesting shared knowledge and possibly specialized training. Settlement patterns show increasing coordination between different communities, with evidence of synchronized defensive preparations and possibly coordinated offensive campaigns. Most significantly, we begin to see the emergence of leadership structures specifically organized around military capability. Not just the strongest individuals or the most charismatic, but people who demonstrated skill in planning raids, coordinating attacks, and managing the complex logistics of mobile warfare. These proto-military leaders left their mark in the archaeological record through distinctive burial practices. They were interred not just with weapons, but with symbols of command, staff heads, ceremonial maces, ornate headgear. Their graves often contained evidence of retainer sacrifice, suggesting they had commanded enough loyalty to take followers with them into death. The emergence of military leadership represents the final piece of the puzzle for systematic warfare. Once you have professional warriors, mobile logistics, and specialized commanders, you have the basic components of an army. The scale might still be small, dozens of fighters rather than thousands, but the organizational principles are the same. What we're witnessing in the archaeological record of 9,000 to 7,000 years ago is the birth of warfare as a social institution. Violence was no longer just a response to immediate threats or opportunities. It was becoming a way of life, a specialized profession, a source of wealth and status that could sustain entire communities. The implications extend far beyond military history. Once raiding became profitable, it created incentives for further militarization. Communities had to choose between becoming raiders themselves or developing better defenses. Either choice required significant social reorganization, resource allocation, and cultural adaptation. But perhaps most importantly, systematic raiding created the first true military economies. Communities that could successfully project violence across long distances could extract tribute from weaker neighbours, control trade routes, and accumulate wealth far beyond what their own production could support. This represented a fundamental break with the economic logic that had governed human societies for millions of years. Instead of wealth being created through production, hunting, gathering, farming, it could now be acquired through extraction. The sword was becoming as important as the plough, and once that realization took hold, the path toward larger, more complex military organizations became almost inevitable. Because in a world where some groups had learned to profit from violence, everyone else had to learn to defend against it, or risk becoming someone else's source of income. The age of raids was ending. The age of armies was about to begin. From chiefs to kings, when leaders learned to kill. By 6,000 years ago, something had crystallized in human societies that would change everything. The realization that violence could be organized, directed, and sustained not just for immediate gain, but for long-term power. This wasn't the opportunistic raiding of earlier periods or the desperate defense of threatened communities. This was something new. Violence as administration, conflict as governance, war as a tool of statecraft. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of increasing complexity, but also increasing brutality. Across the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the highlands of Anatolia, and the fertile plains of the Levant, we begin to see evidence of societies that had learned to institutionalize conflict, not just to fight when necessary, but to maintain the capacity for violence as a permanent feature of their social organization. The key innovation was hierarchy. For most of human history, leadership had been situational and temporary. The best hunter led the hunt. The most knowledgeable elder guided important decisions. Authority was distributed, contextual, and constantly negotiated. But as communities grew larger and conflicts became more complex, this ad hoc approach to leadership became insufficient. Someone had to coordinate defensive preparations across multiple settlements. Someone had to plan offensive campaigns that might last weeks or months. Someone had to manage the complex logistics of feeding, equipping, and directing dozens or hundreds of fighters simultaneously. The solution was specialization. Just as communities had developed specialized potters, weavers, and metalworkers, they began to develop specialized military leaders, not just warriors who fought when called upon, but individuals whose primary role was thinking about violence, planning for it, and organizing others to execute it effectively. These early military specialists left distinctive traces in the archaeological record. Their burials show unprecedented concentrations of weapons and military equipment, not just personal arms, but command regalia, ceremonial maces, decorated helmets, ornate daggers that were too elaborate for practical combat use. These were symbols of authority, markers of individuals who had transcended the role of simple fighters to become directors of organized violence. At sites like Arslan Tepe in eastern Anatolia, dating to around 3400 BCE, excavators found evidence of what can only be described as a military aristocracy. Elite residences contained weapons caches that could have equipped small armies. Storage facilities held not just food and trade goods, but specialized military supplies, arrow points by the hundreds, sling stones in carefully sorted sizes, bronze spear tips of standardized design. The standardization is particularly significant. When weapons become uniform across multiple sites and regions, it suggests centralized production and distribution. Someone was not just organizing individual raids or defensive actions, but coordinating military activities across entire regions. The scale of organization required for such coordination represents a quantum leap in human social complexity. But military hierarchy created new problems even as it solved old ones. How do you maintain control over people whose primary skill is violence? How do you prevent successful military leaders from turning their followers against their own communities? How do you balance the need for aggressive, decisive leadership in warfare with the need for stable, predictable governance in peacetime? The answer, it seems, was ritual and ideology. Military leadership became wrapped in religious symbolism, divine mandate, and elaborate ceremony. Leaders weren't just successful fighters, they were chosen by the gods, blessed by ancestors, endowed with supernatural authority that transcended mere physical prowess. Evidence for this ritualization of military power appears across multiple early state societies. At Hierakonpolis in pre-dynastic Egypt, wall paintings show larger-than-life figures wielding maces over bound captives. These aren't documentary depictions of specific battles, they're ideological statements about the nature of legitimate authority. The king isn't just someone who can win fights, he's someone who has the divine right to inflict violence on behalf of the community. Similar patterns appear in early Mesopotamian art and architecture. The famous Standard of Ur, dating to around 2600 BCE, shows military processions alongside scenes of religious ceremony and royal banqueting. War, worship, and governance are presented as interconnected aspects of a single system of social organization. But ideology alone wasn't sufficient to maintain military hierarchies. There had to be material incentives as well. Successful military leaders needed to reward their followers, not just with immediate spoils from raids, but with ongoing access to resources and status. This created pressure for expansion, not just occasional raids for immediate gain, but systematic campaigns of conquest that could generate the sustained wealth needed to maintain professional military organizations. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of such systematic expansion. Settlement patterns suggest the absorption of smaller communities by larger ones. Material culture becomes increasingly homogenized across wider areas, suggesting political unification rather than just cultural exchange. And most tellingly, we begin to see evidence of tribute systems, the flow of wealth from peripheral areas to emerging centers of power. At sites like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, the scale of resource accumulation becomes almost incomprehensible. Massive temple complexes that would have required the labor of thousands. Administrative buildings filled with thousands of clay tablets documenting the flow of goods from across the known world. Craft workshops producing luxury items that could only have been intended for elite consumption. This wasn't wealth generated through local production. The agricultural capacity of southern Mesopotamia, while significant, could never have supported such concentrations of resources through farming alone. The wealth had to be coming from elsewhere, through trade, tribute, or outright conquest. The cuneiform tablets from this period provide unprecedented insight into how these early extraction systems operated. Administrative records document deliveries of livestock, grain, and manufactured goods from dozens of outlying settlements. Military texts describe campaigns against communities that had failed to provide expected tribute. Legal documents outline the obligations of subject populations to their military overlords. What emerges from these records is a picture of systematic, institutionalized violence operating at previously unimaginable scales. Not just raids or battles, but coordinated campaigns involving hundreds or thousands of participants. Not just temporary alliances, but permanent military hierarchies with specialized roles, standardized equipment, and professional training. The social implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, significant portions of the population were being supported not through their own productive labor, but through their ability to extract resources from others through the threat or application of violence. Warriors, commanders, administrators, and the craft specialists who served them all were part of an economy that ultimately depended on the systematic intimidation of agricultural populations. This created a new kind of social stratification, based not just on access to resources, but on proximity to violence. Those who controlled the means of organized coercion occupied the apex of the social hierarchy. Those who could serve the military apparatus as fighters, suppliers, or administrators enjoyed intermediate status, and those who could only produce, farmers, herders, simple crafters, found themselves at the bottom of increasingly rigid social pyramids. The psychological impact of this transformation can only be imagined. For millions of years, human societies had been relatively egalitarian. Status differences existed, but they were usually temporary, contextual, and limited in scope. The strongest hunter didn't necessarily dominate other aspects of social life. The most knowledgeable elder didn't necessarily control resource distribution. But military hierarchies were different. They were permanent, comprehensive, and backed by the ultimate threat. Once someone achieved a position of military authority, they could use that position to control every other aspect of social life: economic production, religious practice, marriage arrangements, even basic survival, all became subject to the decisions of military elites. The emergence of military aristocracies also changed the fundamental logic of inter-community relations. Previously, conflicts had been limited by their own destructiveness. Communities that exhausted themselves through warfare couldn't survive economically, but professional military organizations changed this equation. They could sustain conflicts indefinitely as long as they could extract resources from subject populations. This created incentives for perpetual warfare. Military elites needed ongoing conflicts to justify their privileged positions and to generate the wealth needed to maintain their followers' loyalty. Peace became economically problematic for societies whose governing classes depended on violence for their livelihood. By 5,000 years ago, this logic had spread across much of the ancient world, from the city-states of Mesopotamia to the emerging kingdoms of Egypt, from the highland chiefdoms of Anatolia to the trading centres of the Indus Valley. Human societies were being reorganized around the systematic application of violence for political and economic gain. The transformation wasn't complete. Many communities remained outside these emerging state systems, maintaining older forms of social organization. But the direction of change was clear. Societies that could organize violence effectively were expanding at the expense of those that couldn't. Military innovation was becoming the primary driver of social evolution. What we're witnessing in the archaeological record of this period isn't just the emergence of warfare as we recognize it today. It's the birth of the military-industrial complex, the creation of social systems specifically designed to generate and sustain organized violence on an unprecedented scale. The implications extend far beyond military history. Once violence became institutionalized as a tool of governance, it created feedback loops that would shape human civilization for thousands of years to come. The need to maintain military superiority drove technological innovation. The need to support professional armies drove economic expansion. The need to justify perpetual warfare drove the development of complex ideologies and belief systems. From this point forward, human history would be dominated not by the gradual evolution of peaceful communities, but by the explosive expansion of military states. The age of raids had ended. The age of empires was about to begin. And once that transformation was complete, the small-scale violence of prehistoric communities would seem almost quaint by comparison. Because humans had finally learned to organize killing as efficiently as they had once organized hunting. The only question remaining was what they would do with that terrible new capability. The final transformation, when war became eternal. By 4,000 years ago, something unprecedented had emerged from the river valleys and highland plateaus of the ancient world. The first true military states. These weren't just communities that could fight when necessary, or even societies organized around systematic raiding. These were civilizations that had made warfare their primary organizing principle, their source of wealth, their method of governance, and ultimately, their reason for existence. The transformation wasn't sudden or uniform. It emerged gradually, unevenly, through a process of competitive selection that favoured societies capable of projecting violence across ever greater distances and timescales. Communities that could organise larger armies conquered those that couldn't. Societies that could sustain longer campaigns absorbed those that couldn't. Civilizations that could institutionalise violence as a permanent feature of their social organisation expanded at the expense of those that treated warfare as an unfortunate necessity. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of escalating militarisation that would have been unimaginable to earlier human societies. At sites like Mari in Syria, Knossos in Crete, and Harappa in the Indus Valley, we find evidence of administrative systems dedicated almost entirely to the logistics of organised violence. Palace archives document the recruitment, training, and provisioning of professional armies. Craft workshops mass produce standardised weapons and military equipment. Agricultural systems are reorganised to support not just local populations, but the massive caloric requirements of full-time warriors. The scale of organisation required for such systems represents a cognitive revolution comparable to the development of language or agriculture. Managing an army of thousands requires sophisticated communication networks, hierarchical command structures, and logistical capabilities that push human organisational abilities to their limits. Someone had to coordinate the production of weapons, the training of fighters, the accumulation of supplies, and the movement of forces across vast distances, all while maintaining the complex web of alliances, tribute relationships, and administrative controls that held these early states together. But perhaps the most significant innovation of this period wasn't technological or organisational, it was conceptual. For the first time in human history, violence became divorced from immediate material needs, or even rational political objectives. War became an end in itself, a cultural practice that justified its own existence through elaborate mythologies, religious systems, and social structures. The evidence for this conceptual shift appears in multiple forms across the archaeological record. Monumental architecture, dedicated to military themes, victory monuments, warrior statues, elaborate depictions of battle scenes that serve no practical purpose beyond glorifying violence, religious systems that placed war gods at the centre of their pantheons and treated successful warriors as semi-divine figures, economic systems that channeled enormous resources toward military displays, weapons production, and the support of professional fighting classes. At Mycenae in Greece, the famous Lion Gate provides a perfect example of this militarization of culture. Built around 1250 BCE, it's not just a defensive structure, but a symbolic statement about the nature of power. The massive stones, the imposing architecture, the heraldic lions, all communicate a message about strength, dominance, and the willingness to use violence that goes far beyond mere practical considerations. Similar monuments appear across the ancient world during this period. The victory steles of Mesopotamian kings, covered with detailed depictions of enemy cities being destroyed and captive populations being led away in chains. the elaborate tomb paintings of Egyptian pharaohs, showing them personally slaughtering enemies in battle. The massive fortification systems of Bronze Age settlements, designed as much to impress potential attackers as to actually defend against them. But the true measure of this transformation appears in the human cost. Population genetics from this period shows dramatic demographic disruptions that can only be explained by systematic, large-scale violence. Entire regions show evidence of population replacement, with local genetic lineages disappearing and being replaced by those from distant areas. Archaeological layers document the destruction and abandonment of hundreds of settlements across Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The scale of destruction suggests conflicts that were no longer limited by practical constraints. These weren't raids for immediate gain or defensive actions to protect specific territories. They were campaigns of systematic elimination, designed to remove entire populations from their ancestral lands and replace them with more politically reliable settlers. The Bronze Age collapse, which occurred around 1200 BCE across much of the Mediterranean world, provides a dramatic example of how thorough this militarization had become. Within a span of less than a century, virtually every major civilization, from Mycenaean Greece to Hittite Anatolia to New Kingdom Egypt, experienced catastrophic social collapse. Cities were burned, populations scattered, complex administrative systems abandoned. The traditional explanation for this collapse focuses on external factors: climate change, natural disasters, invasions by mysterious sea peoples. But the archaeological evidence suggests something more systematic. A civilization that had become so dependent on organized violence that it could no longer function when that violence spiraled beyond control. The societies that collapsed weren't primitive or weak. They were among the most sophisticated military organizations the world had ever seen. They possessed advanced metallurgy, complex logistics, professional armies, and centuries of experience in organized warfare. Their failure wasn't due to external weakness, but to internal contradictions that had become unsustainable. Military states require constant expansion to maintain their economic and social systems. Professional armies need ongoing conflicts to justify their existence. Administrative hierarchies need tribute and plunder to fund their operations. But expansion has natural limits. Eventually, you run out of weaker neighbours to conquer. Eventually, you encounter other military states with equal or superior capabilities. Eventually, the costs of maintaining military readiness begin to exceed the benefits of military success. When that point is reached, military states face a fundamental crisis. They cannot demobilize without losing the basis of their political authority. They cannot maintain their military apparatus without continued expansion. They cannot expand without encountering increasingly formidable opposition. The logic that created their success becomes the source of their destruction. The Bronze Age collapse represents the first time in human history that this dynamic played out on a truly global scale, but it wouldn't be the last. The pattern of military expansion, followed by systemic collapse, would repeat throughout human history. In the fall of Rome, the fragmentation of medieval kingdoms, the cycles of conquest and dissolution that characterized Chinese dynastic history. What makes this period so significant isn't just that it produced the first military states, but that it established the template for all subsequent forms of organized violence. The basic structures developed during the Bronze Age: professional armies, military hierarchies, siege warfare, systematic destruction of enemy populations, would remain essentially unchanged for the next 3,000 years. Even more importantly, this period established violence as a legitimate tool of governance. The idea that rulers have the right to kill their subjects, that states have the obligation to destroy their enemies, that military success justifies political authority, all of these concepts emerged from the militarization of Bronze Age societies and became fundamental assumptions of subsequent civilizations. The psychological transformation was equally profound. For millions of years, humans had lived in small groups where violence was personal, limited, and subject to social controls. Everyone knew everyone else. Conflicts had faces, names, histories. Violence carried emotional and social costs that limited its application. But military states created a new kind of violence, impersonal, systematic, and divorced from immediate social relationships. Soldiers killed strangers on the orders of distant commanders for reasons they might not fully understand. Entire populations could be eliminated not because of personal grievances but because of abstract political calculations made by people they had never met. This depersonalization of violence was perhaps the most revolutionary development in human history. It made possible scales of destruction that would have been psychologically impossible for earlier societies. It created the conceptual framework for genocide, total war, and the systematic elimination of entire cultures and ways of life. By 3000 BCE, the transformation was complete. Humans had learned to organize killing as efficiently as they had once organized hunting. They had created social systems capable of sustaining violence indefinitely, ideologies that justified unlimited destruction, and technologies that could eliminate entire populations with unprecedented efficiency. The small-scale raids and territorial conflicts of prehistoric communities had given way to something qualitatively different: permanent war machines that could operate across continents and persist for centuries. Violence was no longer a tool used occasionally when other methods failed. It had become the foundation of civilization itself. From this point forward, human history would be dominated by the expansion and interaction of military states. Periods of peace would be viewed as temporary interruptions in the natural order of conflict. Innovation would be driven primarily by military competition. Cultural development would be shaped by the needs of organized violence. The story of war's origins had reached its conclusion, not with a single battle or decisive moment, but with the gradual, inexorable transformation of human societies into machines for generating and applying lethal force. The capacity for organized violence that had emerged from small-scale raids and territorial disputes had become the defining characteristic of human civilization. What began as occasional conflicts between neighboring communities had evolved into a planetary system of competing military states locked in perpetual struggle for dominance, resources, and survival. The age of war had begun in earnest, and for the next 5,000 years, it would never truly end. The mathematics of massacre, how we learned to count bodies. Between 3000 and 1500 BCE, something chilling happened to human record keeping. For the first time in our species' history, we began to count the dead not as tragedies to be mourned, but as achievements to be celebrated. The cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphic inscriptions of Egypt, the administrative records of early Bronze Age civilizations, they all tell the same story. War had become so institutionalized that killing could be measured, quantified, and turned into statistics. This wasn't the passionate violence of prehistoric raids or the desperate struggles of early settlements. This was bureaucratic killing, violence administered with the same methodical precision that scribes used to record grain shipments or tax collections. The dead had become data points in a larger system of accounting. At the Palace of Mari, dating to around 1800 BCE, archaeologists found archives containing thousands of tablets documenting military campaigns in meticulous detail. Not just who fought whom, but how many died, how many were captured, how much wealth was seized. One tablet records the destruction of a city called Razama. 20,000 men I slaughtered. Their blood I let flow like a river. Their corpses I piled up like grain heaps. The language is telling. Bodies are described using vocabulary borrowed from agriculture and commerce. Heaps, quantities, measurements. The human cost of warfare had been transformed into bookkeeping, violence into inventory management. Death had become a commodity to be harvested, processed, and tallied. This quantification of killing wasn't just administrative convenience, it served crucial psychological and political functions. By reducing violence to numbers, rulers could distance themselves emotionally from its human cost. A general reporting the death of 20,000 enemies wasn't describing the destruction of 20,000 individuals with families, dreams, and fears. He was providing statistical data about the successful completion of a military objective. The numbers also served as propaganda tools. Inflated casualty figures could intimidate potential enemies, while precise accounting demonstrated administrative competence to domestic audiences. Kings who could provide detailed statistics about their military achievements appeared more capable, more professional, more worthy of the resources required to maintain their war machines. But perhaps most importantly, the quantification of violence made it scalable in ways that had never been possible before. Once killing became a matter of logistics rather than emotion, there were no natural limits to how much destruction could be planned and executed. If you could organise the slaughter of 1,000, you could organise the slaughter of 10,000. If you could document the destruction of one city, you could systematise the elimination of entire regions. The archaeological evidence from this period shows exactly this kind of systematic scaling. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire developed administrative systems capable of coordinating military campaigns across hundreds of miles and multiple years. Their archives document the systematic deportation of entire populations, the calculated destruction of enemy agricultural systems, and the methodical elimination of rival power centres. In Egypt, the New Kingdom pharaohs perfected what we might recognise as total war, campaigns designed not just to defeat enemy armies, but to destroy their capacity for future resistance. The famous battle scenes, carved into temple walls at Karnak and Medine Habu, don't just celebrate military victories, they provide detailed inventories of destruction. Lists of captured cities, counts of severed hands taken as trophies, precise tallies of livestock seized, and populations enslaved. These records reveal a level of systematic violence that would have been incomprehensible to earlier human societies. The pharaoh Ramesses II's account of his campaigns against the Nubians includes the casual mention of destroying 47 fortified towns and carrying off over 100,000 captives. These aren't round numbers or poetic exaggerations. They're administrative statistics, recorded with the same attention to detail as harvest reports or building inventories. The technology of killing was evolving to match this administrative sophistication. Bronze Age armies didn't just fight with better weapons. They fought with standardized equipment, coordinated tactics, and professional training that treated violence as a technical skill rather than an emotional outburst. Archaeological excavations of Bronze Age armories reveal weapons produced in massive quantities with precisely controlled specifications. Not individual weapons crafted for specific warriors, but industrial output designed for mass deployment. At sites like Mycenae and Pylos in Greece, palace archives document the management of military resources with startling precision. Inventories of bronze weapons, lists of chariot components, rosters of specialized military personnel. The famous Linear B tablets from Pylos include records of military preparations that read like modern military logistics, specific quantities of bronze allocated for weapon production, personnel assignments for different military units, provisions calculations for extended campaigns. This industrialization of violence created new categories of human suffering that had never existed before. Warfare was no longer limited by the physical and emotional capacity of individual warriors. It could be sustained indefinitely through systematic organization, professional management, and bureaucratic coordination. Conflicts that might once have burned out after a few seasons could now continue for decades or even centuries. The siege warfare that dominated Bronze Age conflicts exemplifies this transformation. Early human violence had been mobile, opportunistic, limited by the need to maintain food supplies and social cohesion. But Bronze Age armies could maintain sieges for years at a time, systematically starving entire populations into submission while maintaining their own forces through complex supply networks stretching across hundreds of miles. The Siege of Troy, whether historical or mythical, captures the essence of this new kind of warfare, a conflict that could continue for a decade, consuming enormous resources and destroying multiple generations, all for objectives that had become almost abstract through prolonged fighting. This wasn't violence driven by immediate needs or clear grievances. It was violence as a self-sustaining system, feeding on its own momentum. But the most disturbing aspect of this period isn't the scale of violence itself, but the casual acceptance of it as a normal feature of civilized life. Bronze Age literature, art, and religious systems don't treat warfare as a necessary evil or a failure of diplomacy. They celebrate it as the highest expression of human achievement, the activity through which rulers proved their worthiness and societies demonstrated their vitality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, is essentially a meditation on violence and its consequences. But even as it explores the psychological costs of warfare, it takes for granted that organized killing is a fundamental aspect of human nature and political organization. The question isn't whether there should be war, but how warriors should conduct themselves within it. This normalization of violence created cultural feedback loops that made conflicts increasingly difficult to resolve through negotiation or compromise. Societies that had organized themselves around military values couldn't easily transition to peaceful coexistence. Their economic systems depended on tribute and plunder. Their social hierarchies were based on military achievement. Their religious systems glorified warrior gods and promised eternal rewards for those who died in battle. By 1500 BCE, these feedback loops had created a civilizational system that was essentially addicted to violence. Military states needed ongoing conflicts to maintain internal stability. Professional armies required external enemies to justify their existence. Administrative systems that had been designed to manage warfare couldn't easily be repurposed for peaceful activities. The result was a world locked in perpetual conflict, where periods of peace were viewed as temporary anomalies rather than desirable goals. Diplomatic negotiations became tactical maneuvers in longer military campaigns. Trade relationships were subordinated to strategic considerations. Cultural exchange occurred primarily through conquest and forced assimilation. What makes this period so significant in the history of human violence isn't just that it produced larger armies or more sophisticated weapons. It's that it created the conceptual framework that would govern organized killing for the next 3 millennia. The idea that violence could be administered like any other governmental function, that killing could be planned and executed through bureaucratic systems, that human suffering could be reduced to statistical abstractions. All of these concepts emerged from the military states of the Bronze Age. The transformation was so complete that even today, most people accept without question the basic assumptions that emerged during this period. That states have the right to kill in pursuit of political objectives, that military expenditures are necessary investments in security, that professional armies are essential features of civilized society, that some conflicts can only be resolved through violence. These aren't natural or inevitable features of human organization. They're cultural inventions that emerge from specific historical circumstances and became entrenched through thousands of years of institutional development. The casual acceptance of organized violence that characterizes modern societies is a direct inheritance from Bronze Age military states that learned to treat killing as just another administrative function. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this transformation is how invisible it became to the people living within it. The scribes who recorded casualty statistics, the administrators who organised supply chains for military campaigns, the craftsmen who mass-produced weapons. They weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were ordinary people doing their jobs within systems that had normalised violence, to the point where its moral implications became almost unthinkable. The bureaucratisation of killing created a kind of moral numbness that persists to this day. When violence is mediated through complex institutional structures, when killing is carried out by professionals following orders, when destruction is justified through abstract political concepts, the human capacity for empathy and moral reasoning gets overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the systems involved. This is how civilized societies learn to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as moral and rational, not through sudden descents into barbarism, but through the gradual normalization of violence as a legitimate tool of governance. The Bronze Age didn't invent human cruelty, but it did invent ways to organize and justify that cruelty on unprecedented scales. By the end of this period, the transformation was irreversible. Humans had created social systems that were fundamentally dependent on organized violence for their basic functioning. These systems would continue to evolve, becoming more sophisticated, more efficient, and more deadly. But their essential character had been established. Civilizations that treated warfare not as an unfortunate necessity, but as their primary reason for existence. The mathematics of massacre had been perfected. All that remained was to apply them on an ever-expanding scale. The Age of Bronze, the Age of Blood, when metal made murder industrial. Around 3500 BCE, something extraordinary happened in the workshops and forges scattered across ancient Mesopotamia. For the first time in human history, someone discovered that mixing copper with tin created something harder, stronger, more durable than either metal alone. Bronze wasn't just a new material, it was a revolution in the technology of death. The Bronze Age gets its name from this metallurgical breakthrough, but what really defined the period wasn't just better tools for farming or crafting, it was better tools for killing. And once humans learned to work bronze, they learned to die in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Early bronze working was crude, experimental, limited to small objects and decorative items. But by 3000 BCE, metal workers across the ancient world had mastered techniques that would have seemed like magic to their Stone Age predecessors. They could cast complex shapes, create alloys with specific properties, and, most importantly, mass-produce weapons with unprecedented efficiency and lethality. Archaeological sites from this period tell a story of rapid militarization that's both fascinating and terrifying. At places like Alaka-Höyük in Anatolia, royal tombs from around 2500 BCE contained not just individual weapons, but entire arsenals. Bronze swords, spearheads, battle axes, and mace heads, all crafted with a level of sophistication that speaks to specialized knowledge, professional production, and systematic preparation for violence. But it wasn't just the quality of weapons that changed. It was the quantity. Bronze could be melted down and recast, recycled endlessly, shaped into standardized forms that could equip entire armies with identical gear. For the first time, it became possible to outfit hundreds or thousands of warriors with matching equipment, creating military units that fought with coordinated tactics rather than individual prowess. The psychological impact of this standardization was enormous. Stone Age warfare had been personal, individual, limited by the unique characteristics of each handmade weapon. But Bronze Age armies presented walls of identical spear points, ranks of warriors carrying matching shields, formations that moved and struck with mechanical precision. The very sight of such organized lethality must have been overwhelming to opponents still fighting with stone and wood. Bronze also enabled new categories of weapons that were impossible with earlier technologies. The bronze sword in particular represented a quantum leap in personal combat effectiveness. Unlike the clubs, axes, and stabbing spears of earlier periods, swords were designed specifically for killing other humans. They had no other purpose. Their length, balance, and cutting edges were optimized for one thing only: efficiently ending human lives in close combat. The earliest bronze swords appear around 2500 BCE in sites across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. They weren't crude or experimental. They were sophisticated weapons that showed clear understanding of metallurgy, biomechanics, and combat effectiveness. Someone had spent considerable time and effort figuring out exactly how to make bronze into the most efficient human-killing tool possible. But bronze weapons required bronze smiths, and bronze smiths required resources, infrastructure, and social organisation that went far beyond anything earlier societies had managed. Copper and tin deposits were often hundreds of miles apart, requiring trade networks that spanned continents. Smelting required specialised knowledge, high-temperature furnaces, and considerable quantities of fuel. Finishing weapons required skilled craftsmen, proper tools, and time for careful work. All of this meant that Bronze Age warfare became the domain of societies wealthy and organised enough to support industrial-scale weapons production. Not every group could afford bronze armies, which created massive military imbalances that accelerated the pace of conquest and consolidation. Communities with bronze weapons could dominate those without them. Societies that controlled metal resources could project power across vast distances. The result was an arms race that consumed enormous resources and drove technological innovation at unprecedented rates. Archaeological evidence shows rapid improvements in metallurgy, weapon design, and military organisation across the Bronze Age world. New alloy compositions that made weapons harder and more durable. New casting techniques that allowed for more complex shapes and better balance. New tactical innovations that maximised the effectiveness of bronze equipment. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might recognise as military-industrial complexes, entire economic systems organised around the production and deployment of bronze weapons. Palace archives from sites like Pylos and Knossos document elaborate systems for managing military resources, inventories of bronze weapons, rosters of specialised craftsmen, allocation schedules for raw materials. These weren't just armies, they were institutions, bureaucracies dedicated to the systematic production and application of violence. The famous Linear B tablets from Bronze Age Greece include detailed records of military preparations that read like modern Defence Department budgets, specific quantities of bronze allocated for weapon production, personnel assignments for different military specialisations, logistical calculations for extended campaigns. The scale of organisation required for such systems pushed human societies toward unprecedented levels of centralisation and hierarchy. Managing Bronze Age armies required professional administrators, specialised craftsmen, complex supply chains, and powerful rulers capable of coordinating all these elements effectively. The military demands of the Bronze Age essentially forced the invention of the state as we know it, but this militarisation came at a tremendous human cost. Bronze Age warfare wasn't just larger in scale than earlier conflicts, it was qualitatively different in its destructiveness. The combination of superior weapons, professional armies, and systematic organisation made possible levels of violence that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age destruction layers tells a story of unprecedented brutality. At Troy, the famous archaeological site that may or may not correspond to Homer's epic, multiple destruction layers show evidence of systematic burning, mass killing, and complete urban abandonment. Similar patterns appear at sites across the ancient world, entire cities destroyed so thoroughly that they were never rebuilt, their populations scattered or eliminated. The Hittite Empire, which dominated much of Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia during the Late Bronze Age, developed what can only be described as systematic techniques for destroying enemy societies. Their archives document not just military victories, but deliberate policies of population deportation, agricultural destruction, and cultural elimination. Entire regions were depopulated and resettled with more politically reliable populations. In Egypt, the New Kingdom pharaohs perfected similar techniques on an even grander scale. The temple reliefs at Karnak show Ramesses II's armies returning from campaigns in Nubia with precise tallies of their destruction. Thousands of enemies killed, entire cities burned, vast quantities of livestock seized, and huge numbers of captives taken for slavery. These weren't occasional raids, they were annual campaigns, systematic exploitation of neighbouring societies to fuel Egypt's military expansion. The Bronze Age also saw the emergence of siege warfare as a dominant military technique. Earlier conflicts had been mobile, opportunistic, limited by the need to maintain food supplies and avoid prolonged exposure to enemy retaliation. But Bronze Age armies could maintain sieges for months or years, systematically starving entire populations into submission, while supporting their own forces through elaborate supply networks. The siege techniques developed during this period were horrifyingly effective. Archaeological excavations at sites like Lachish in Israel show evidence of systematic siege warfare that reduced entire cities to rubble, massive earthwork ramps built to breach walls, evidence of deliberate burning and destruction, mass graves containing the remains of entire populations killed during the final assault. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bronze Age warfare was how routine it became. The administrative records from this period treat military campaigns with the same bureaucratic detachment as harvest reports or building projects. Casualty figures are recorded alongside inventory lists. The destruction of cities is documented with the same precision as the construction of palaces. This bureaucratization of violence created a kind of moral distance that made unprecedented levels of destruction psychologically manageable for the people organizing it. When killing becomes a matter of logistics rather than emotion, when destruction is measured in statistical abstractions rather than human suffering, there are no natural limits to how much violence can be planned and executed. The Late Bronze Age collapse, which occurred around 1200 BCE, may represent the first time in human history that organised violence became so systematic and widespread that it destroyed the very civilizations that had created it. Within the span of a few decades, virtually every major Bronze Age power, from Mycenaean Greece to Hittite Anatolia to New Kingdom Egypt, experienced catastrophic social collapse. The traditional explanations for this collapse focus on external factors: climate change, natural disasters, invasions by mysterious sea peoples. But the archaeological evidence suggests something more systematic. Civilizations that had become so dependent on organised violence that they could no longer function when that violence spiralled beyond their control. The societies that collapsed weren't weak or primitive. They were among the most sophisticated military organisations the world had ever seen. They possessed advanced metallurgy, professional armies, complex logistics, and centuries of experience in systematic warfare. Their failure suggests something darker, that the very systems they had created to project violence outward eventually turned inward, consuming the societies that had given them birth. By 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age military system had reached its logical conclusion. Societies organised around systematic violence had created technologies, institutions, and cultural practices that made unprecedented levels of destruction not just possible, but inevitable. The bronze that had promised to make humans more powerful had instead made them more vulnerable to their own capacity for organised killing. The collapse wasn't the end of the story. New civilizations would emerge from the ruins, armed with iron weapons and even more sophisticated techniques for organizing violence. But the Bronze Age had established the template that would govern human warfare for the next 3 millennia. The idea that societies could and should organize themselves around the systematic application of lethal force. What began as a metallurgical innovation, mixing copper with tin to create a harder alloy, had become something much darker. The Bronze Age didn't just give humans better tools, it gave them the first industrial system for producing death on a mass scale. And once that system was created, it would prove almost impossible to dismantle. The Age of Bronze was ending, but the age of systematic, bureaucratic, industrialized killing was just beginning. The techniques developed during this period, professional armies, siege warfare, systematic destruction of enemy societies, bureaucratic management of violence, would remain the foundation of organized warfare until the present day. Humans had learned to make killing efficient, systematic, and sustainable. They had discovered that violence could be organized like any other human activity, managed like any other resource, deployed like any other tool of statecraft. The only question remaining was how much destruction they were willing to inflict in pursuit of their political objectives. The answer, as the next 3,000 years would demonstrate, was there were no limits at all. The Great Dying, when civilization collapsed into itself. By 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world had built something unprecedented in human history. A network of military states so sophisticated, so interconnected, and so dependent on organized violence that when it finally collapsed, it took nearly everything with it. What happened next wasn't just the end of an era, it was humanity's first experience with civilizational suicide on a global scale. The collapse didn't announce itself with trumpets or declarations of war. It crept in like a fever, spreading through the trade routes and diplomatic networks that had once been the Bronze Age world's greatest strength. Within the span of a few generations, virtually every major power from the Aegean to the Euphrates simply stopped. Cities were abandoned, palaces burned, writing systems vanished. Entire populations disappeared from the archaeological record as if they had never existed. The scope of the destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. Mycenaean Greece, with its massive palace complexes and sophisticated military organization, collapsed so completely that the Greeks forgot how to write for nearly 400 years. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries and maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Babylon, vanished so thoroughly that their capital city remained lost until the 20th century. Even Egypt, the most stable civilization in the ancient world, saw its empire crumble and its military power evaporate. But here's what makes this collapse so haunting from our perspective. Tracing the origins of war, it wasn't caused by some external catastrophe. It was caused by the very systems of organized violence that these civilizations had spent centuries perfecting. They had created war machines so efficient, so consuming, that they eventually devoured the societies that built them. The archaeological evidence tells a story of societies that had become addicted to military expansion, but had reached the natural limits of that expansion. Every Bronze Age power was surrounded by other Bronze Age powers, with equally sophisticated armies, equally professional military organizations, equally advanced weapons technology. The easy conquests were over. The only targets left were opponents who could fight back just as effectively. What followed was a kind of military stalemate that consumed enormous resources without producing the wealth and captives that had sustained earlier expansion. Palace archives from the final centuries of the Bronze Age show increasing evidence of economic strain, social unrest, and military expenditures that were becoming unsustainable. These weren't poor societies, they were rich societies that had organized themselves around systems that required constant growth but had run out of room to grow. The collapse, when it came, was systemic. It wasn't just armies defeating armies or cities conquering cities. It was the breakdown of the entire network of relationships that held the Bronze Age world together. Trade routes became too dangerous to maintain. Diplomatic alliances crumbled as partners became threats. Professional armies turned into roving bands of mercenaries with no masters to pay them and no enemies wealthy enough to be worth fighting. Some scholars have tried to explain the collapse through external factors: climate change, natural disasters, invasions by mysterious sea peoples who appear in Egyptian records as destroyers of cities and civilizations. But the more we learn about this period, the more it looks like these external pressures simply triggered the collapse of systems that were already becoming unstable. The sea peoples themselves were probably not foreign invaders, but refugees from Bronze Age societies that had already collapsed, displaced populations with military training and no homeland to return to. They weren't conquering the Bronze Age world, they were scavenging its corpse. The climate changes of this period weren't unprecedented disasters, but relatively minor shifts that became catastrophic because Bronze Age societies had become so centralized, so dependent on long-distance trade, so committed to supporting large populations through military extraction rather than local production. When the delicate networks that held everything together began to fray, there were no backup systems, no local resilience, no way to adapt. What we're looking at isn't the first example of civilizational collapse in human history. It's the first example of collapse caused specifically by the militarization of society. These weren't societies that failed to develop effective military systems. They were societies that became so successful at organizing violence that they couldn't function without it. The psychological dimensions of this collapse are perhaps even more significant than the material ones. Bronze Age societies had spent centuries developing cultural values, religious systems, and social structures that glorified warfare and treated military success as the highest form of human achievement. When those military systems began to fail, they took everything else with them. How do you maintain social cohesion in a warrior culture when there are no more victories to celebrate? How do you justify elaborate hierarchies based on military achievement when military campaigns are no longer profitable? How do you motivate professional armies when there's no plunder to distribute and no glory to be won? The palace archives from the final decades of Bronze Age civilization show increasing evidence of internal conflict, social breakdown, and the kind of political instability that occurs when the fundamental organizing principles of society stop working. These weren't societies conquered by superior enemies. They were societies that lost the ability to explain to themselves why they existed. The collapse also reveals something crucial about the nature of early warfare that connects directly to our larger story about the origins of organized violence. Bronze Age military systems weren't just tools for achieving political objectives, they had become the political objectives themselves. War wasn't something these societies did, it was something they were. This represents the completion of a transformation that had been underway since the first raids and territorial conflicts of prehistoric communities. Violence had evolved from a means to an end, from a tool used occasionally when other methods failed, to the organizing principle of entire civilizations. And once that transformation was complete, those civilizations became trapped by their own success. They couldn't demobilize their armies without losing the basis of their political authority. They couldn't stop expanding without facing economic collapse. They couldn't negotiate with their enemies because their entire social structure was built around the assumption that enemies existed to be destroyed, not accommodated. The Bronze Age collapse represents humanity's first encounter with what we might call the military-industrial trap, the point at which societies become so dependent on organized violence that they can't survive without it. but can't sustain it indefinitely either. It's a pattern that would repeat throughout history, but this was the first time it played out on such a vast scale. What makes this collapse particularly relevant to understanding the origins of war is that it demonstrates how completely the logic of organised violence had penetrated human civilization by 1200 BCE. These weren't societies that occasionally resorted to warfare when diplomacy failed. They were societies whose entire economic, political, and cultural systems were organised around the assumption that systematic violence was not just necessary, but desirable. The collapse forced a kind of reset in human civilization. The societies that emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age world had to rediscover agriculture, trade, writing, and urban life almost from scratch. But they also inherited the memory of what organised violence could accomplish, the technological knowledge of how to create effective military systems, and the cultural templates that justified systematic killing as a tool of governance. When civilization re-emerged in the Iron Age, it would be built on the same fundamental assumptions about violence and power that had characterized the Bronze Age world. The techniques would be refined, the scale would be expanded, but the basic logic would remain the same, that human societies could and should organize themselves around the systematic application of lethal force. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't the end of the story of organized warfare. It was a pause, a temporary interruption, in a process that would resume with even greater intensity once new civilizations had accumulated sufficient resources and population to support professional military systems again. But it does represent a crucial milestone in our understanding of how war became embedded in human civilization. By 1200 BCE, the transformation was complete. Humans had learned to organize killing so effectively that it could sustain entire civilizations for centuries. They had also learned that such systems carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. The societies that collapsed during this period had achieved something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They had created social systems capable of systematic violence on an industrial scale. The fact that those systems eventually consumed the societies that created them doesn't diminish their historical significance. It demonstrates how completely the logic of organised warfare had penetrated human civilization. From this point forward, every human society would have to grapple with the legacy of the Bronze Age military revolution. They would inherit technologies, institutions, and cultural assumptions that made large-scale organised violence not just possible, but, in many contexts, inevitable. The question wasn't whether there would be war, but how it would be organised, justified, and controlled. The Bronze Age collapse marked the end of humanity's first experiment with industrial-scale warfare. But it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of organised violence, one that would prove even more sophisticated, even more systematic, and ultimately even more destructive than anything the Bronze Age world had imagined. The Age of Empires was about to begin, and when it did, the military innovations of the Bronze Age would seem almost quaint by comparison. After the fire, the Iron Revolution, and the democratization of death. When the Bronze Age world collapsed around 1200 BCE, it left behind a landscape scattered with abandoned cities, forgotten technologies, and displaced populations, who remembered just enough about organised violence to be dangerous. But it also left behind something else, a power vacuum that would soon be filled by societies armed with a new technology that would make the bronze weapons of the previous age look like toys. Iron wasn't discovered in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. It had been known for centuries as a rare, precious material, harder to work than bronze, but potentially more durable. What changed wasn't the knowledge of how to smelt iron, but access to it. The collapse of Bronze Age trading networks had disrupted the carefully managed systems that controlled access to copper and tin. But iron ore was everywhere, and once you knew how to work it, you didn't need elaborate trade networks or royal monopolies to arm yourself. The Iron Age didn't begin with a single innovation or a dramatic moment of discovery. It emerged gradually unevenly as scattered communities across the former Bronze Age world began experimenting with techniques that had once been the closely guarded secrets of palace workshops. Blacksmiths who had learned their trade in the service of Bronze Age kings found themselves working for village chiefs, local warlords, and anyone else who could provide food and protection in exchange for weapons. This democratization of metallurgy had profound implications for the organization of violence. Bronze Age warfare had been the domain of wealthy societies that could afford elaborate supply chains and professional military establishments. But iron weapons could be produced locally by individual craftsmen using materials that were available almost everywhere. For the first time since the invention of organized warfare, military technology was becoming accessible to anyone with the knowledge and determination to use it. The results were predictable and terrifying. Across the former Bronze Age world, new forms of political organization began to emerge, smaller, more mobile, more militarily focused than the palace-centered civilizations they replaced. These weren't the elaborate bureaucratic states of the Bronze Age, with their complex administrative systems and diplomatic networks. These were warrior societies organized around the systematic application of violence, but operating at scales that made them more flexible and resilient than their predecessors. In the highlands of Anatolia, groups like the Phrygians emerged from the collapse with military technologies that combined Bronze Age organizational knowledge with Iron Age weapons technology. Their armies weren't as large as Hittite forces had been, but they were more mobile, better armed relative to their size, and capable of projecting power across distances that would have been logistically impossible for Bronze Age civilizations. Similar patterns appeared across the Mediterranean world. In Greece, the collapse of Mycenaean civilization was followed by the emergence of the polis system, city-states that were essentially militarized communities organized around the principle that every citizen was also a warrior. The famous hoplite system that would dominate Greek warfare for centuries was made possible by iron technology that allowed individual communities to arm substantial numbers of fighters without depending on royal arsenals or palace workshops. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might call entrepreneurial warfare, violence organized not by established states or traditional elites, but by individuals who could gather followers, acquire weapons, and carve out territories through successful military campaigns. The collapse had created opportunities for social mobility through violence that hadn't existed during the more hierarchical Bronze Age. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of this militarization of society. Settlement patterns shift toward defensible positions. Burial practices begin to emphasize martial prowess over administrative authority. Art and material culture increasingly focus on military themes, warrior identities, and the glorification of combat effectiveness rather than royal power or religious authority. Most tellingly, we begin to see the emergence of what anthropologists call warrior bands, groups of professional fighters who operated independently of traditional political structures, offering their services to whoever could pay them, or following successful leaders on campaigns of conquest and plunder. These weren't the disciplined armies of Bronze Age states, but they were often more effective because they were more flexible, more motivated, and less constrained by the political considerations that had limited Bronze Age military operations. The Iron Age also saw crucial innovations in military organization that would shape warfare for centuries to come. Without the elaborate administrative systems of Bronze Age states, Iron Age societies had to develop more efficient methods for coordinating military activities. This led to innovations in command structure, tactical coordination, and strategic planning that were often superior to Bronze Age approaches, despite requiring fewer resources. The Greek phalanx, the Roman legion, the Celtic warband, all of these military systems emerged during the early Iron Age as solutions to the problem of organizing effective violence without the bureaucratic infrastructure that Bronze Age civilizations had relied upon. They represented a kind of military streamlining, focused on combat effectiveness rather than administrative complexity. But the most significant long-term consequence of the Iron Age military revolution was psychological rather than technological. The democratization of weapons technology meant that violence was no longer the exclusive domain of established elites. Anyone with sufficient skill, courage, and ruthlessness could potentially carve out a position of power through military success. This created a fundamentally different relationship between violence and social organization. Bronze Age societies had been built around the assumption that warfare was a specialized activity managed by professional military establishments under royal authority. Iron Age societies operated on the assumption that violence was a basic life skill, something that any adult male, and sometimes female, might need to employ in pursuit of personal or community objectives. The cultural implications were enormous. Iron Age literature, art, and religious systems reflect this democratization of violence through their emphasis on individual martial prowess rather than collective military organization. The heroes of Iron Age epics aren't generals or kings commanding vast armies, but individual warriors whose personal combat skills allow them to achieve otherwise impossible objectives. Homer's Iliad, composed during the early Iron Age but set during the Bronze Age, reflects this transformation in its focus on individual combat and personal honor, rather than the kind of systematic military organization that actually characterized Bronze Age warfare. The poem's popularity suggests that Iron Age audiences were more interested in stories about personal martial excellence than in accounts of bureaucratic military efficiency. This shift in cultural values had practical consequences for how violence was organized and justified. Iron Age societies developed elaborate codes of martial honor, warrior ethics, and combat rituals that served to channel and control the democratized violence that iron weapons had made possible. These weren't just cultural ornaments, they were practical solutions to the problem of maintaining social cohesion in communities where large numbers of individuals had both the means and the motivation to use deadly force. The development of these warrior codes represents another crucial step in the evolution of organized violence. For the first time, human societies were grappling with the challenge of regulating violence not from above, through royal authority or priestly prohibition, but from within, through shared cultural values and peer pressure among armed communities. The effectiveness of these systems varied considerably. Some Iron Age societies, like Sparta, developed warrior cultures so comprehensive and effective that they dominated their regions for centuries. Others, like the Celtic communities of Western Europe, created warrior societies that were militarily formidable but politically unstable, prone to internal conflict and external conquest. But all of them represented experiments in organizing violence that were fundamentally different from both the prehistoric patterns we examined at the beginning of this story and the bureaucratic military systems of the Bronze Age. They were societies that had learned to live with the reality that effective weapons were widely available, and that violence was therefore a constant possibility that had to be managed rather than prevented. The Iron Age also saw the emergence of new scales of military organization that combined the flexibility of smaller warrior bands with the striking power of larger armies. Military confederations, tribal alliances, and temporary coalitions allowed Iron Age societies to assemble forces comparable in size to Bronze Age armies while maintaining the tactical advantages of more decentralized organization. The success of these hybrid systems is evident in their expansion. Iron Age military organizations proved capable of conquering territories that had once been controlled by Bronze Age civilizations, often with smaller forces and fewer resources. The superior weapons technology, combined with more flexible organizational structures, created military advantages that established political structures couldn't match. By 800 BCE, the transformation was largely complete. The Bronze Age world of palace-centered bureaucratic states had been replaced by a more diverse, more militarized landscape of warrior societies, city-states, tribal confederations, and emerging kingdoms that combined Iron Age military technology with new forms of political organisation. These societies retained the Bronze Age understanding that organised violence could be used systematically for political and economic objectives, but they had also developed new approaches to organising that violence that were more accessible, more flexible, and ultimately more sustainable than their Bronze Age predecessors. The stage was set for the next phase in the evolution of organised warfare, the emergence of true empires that would combine Iron Age military effectiveness with new forms of political organisation capable of sustaining large-scale conquest and administration over unprecedented distances and time periods. The democratization of violence that characterized the early Iron Age would soon give way to its re-centralization under imperial systems that learned to harness the military potential of Iron Age warrior cultures while subjecting them to more systematic political control. But that's a story for the next chapter in humanity's long, dark journey toward industrial-scale organized killing. The Iron Age had established the principle that effective military technology should be widely available, and that violence was a legitimate tool for achieving social mobility and political objectives. Once those principles were established, it was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to organize them on a truly massive scale. The age of empires was about to dawn, and when it did, the small-scale warrior societies of the early Iron Age would provide both the military techniques and the cultural justifications that would make possible levels of systematic violence that would have been incomprehensible to any previous human civilization. The democratization of death was complete. Now it was time to industrialize it. The birth of the military mind, how war became a science. By 700 BCE, something unprecedented was happening in the training grounds and war councils of emerging Iron Age powers. For the first time in human history, violence was being studied systematically, not just practiced, but analysed, theorised, and refined through careful observation and deliberate experimentation. War was becoming a science, complete with principles, methodologies, and bodies of accumulated knowledge that could be taught, learned, and improved upon across generations. This transformation wasn't immediately obvious to the people living through it. To a Greek hoplite training with his phalanx or a Roman recruit learning to march in formation, these developments probably felt like practical adaptations to immediate military needs. But what was actually happening was far more significant: the birth of military thinking as a distinct intellectual discipline. The evidence for this cognitive revolution appears in multiple forms across the archaeological and literary record. Military manuals begin to appear, not just lists of equipment or records of campaigns, but systematic discussions of tactics, strategy, and the principles underlying effective violence. Training becomes standardized and professional rather than informal and traditional. Military leadership starts to require specialized knowledge rather than just personal courage or social status. In China, texts like The Art of War, attributed to Sun Tzu and dating to around the 6th century BCE, represent completely new approaches to thinking about organized violence. These aren't heroic narratives celebrating individual warriors or chronicles of specific battles. They're analytical works that treat warfare as a complex system that can be understood, predicted, and optimized through careful study. The very existence of such texts indicates a fundamental shift in how humans conceptualized violence. Earlier societies had certainly developed sophisticated military techniques, but those techniques were transmitted through apprenticeship, imitation, and practical experience. The idea that warfare could be reduced to abstract principles that could be studied independently of specific contexts was revolutionary. Similar developments appear across the Iron Age world. In Greece, the emergence of systematic military training, reflected in sources like Xenophon's works on horsemanship and military command shows a new emphasis on the intellectual dimensions of warfare. Fighting was no longer just about physical prowess or personal courage. It required study, analysis, and careful preparation. The Roman military system, which would eventually dominate the Mediterranean world, represented perhaps the most complete realization of this scientific approach to violence. Roman military organization wasn't based primarily on traditional warrior cultures or heroic individual leadership. It was based on systematic analysis of what made armies effective, careful study of enemy capabilities and weaknesses, and continuous refinement of techniques based on battlefield experience. Roman military manuals, training programs, and organizational structures reflect an almost modern approach to military effectiveness. They standardized equipment not just for cost efficiency, but because standardization enabled more predictable tactical performance. They developed promotion systems based on demonstrated competence rather than social status. They created specialized roles for different types of military expertise: engineering, logistics, intelligence, siege warfare. But perhaps most importantly, they developed systematic approaches to learning from both success and failure. Roman armies didn't just win battles, they analysed why they won, what techniques had been most effective, and how those techniques could be improved or adapted for different situations. They also studied their defeats carefully, developing new approaches based on understanding what had gone wrong. This scientific approach to warfare had profound implications that extended far beyond military effectiveness. It created new categories of human knowledge and expertise. Military engineering became a specialized discipline. Logistics evolved from ad hoc supply gathering to systematic analysis of resource requirements and distribution networks. Intelligence gathering developed from casual scouting to organized information collection and analysis. The emergence of military science also changed the social status of violence in human societies. Warfare had always been prestigious in warrior cultures, but it had been prestigious primarily because of its association with personal courage and heroic achievement. The scientific approach to violence created prestige based on intellectual mastery of complex systems, a fundamentally different kind of social distinction. This intellectual approach to violence created feedback loops that accelerated military innovation at unprecedented rates. Once warfare became a subject of systematic study, improvements could be developed more rapidly and transmitted more effectively across different military organizations. Successful innovations could be analyzed, refined, and incorporated into training programs. Failed experiments could be studied to understand why they hadn't worked. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of this accelerating innovation. Weapon designs become more sophisticated and specialized. Fortification systems show increasing complexity and effectiveness. Military organization becomes more hierarchical and professional. Most tellingly, we see evidence of systematic experimentation with new techniques, equipment, and tactical approaches. At sites like the Roman training camps along Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists have found evidence of elaborate facilities for military education that go far beyond simple weapons training. These were institutions designed to teach not just combat skills, but strategic thinking, logistical planning, and administrative competence. The Roman army had become a school for systematic violence, but the scientific approach to warfare also created new forms of military vulnerability. Armies that relied heavily on systematic training and standardized procedures could be defeated by opponents who understood their methods and could develop effective countermeasures. The very predictability that made systematic military science effective also made it potentially exploitable by clever enemies. This led to the development of what we might recognize as military intelligence and counterintelligence operations. Armies needed to understand enemy capabilities while protecting their own methods from enemy analysis. Warfare became not just about the application of force, but about information management, deception, and the systematic study of enemy weaknesses. The emergence of military deception as a systematic discipline represents another crucial development in the evolution of organised violence. Earlier warfare had certainly included elements of surprise and misdirection, but these were typically opportunistic tactics rather than systematic approaches to information warfare. The scientific approach to violence created the conceptual framework for treating deception as a distinct military specialty, requiring its own techniques, training, and expertise. The psychological dimensions of this transformation were equally significant. The scientific approach to warfare required military leaders to think about violence in abstract analytical terms rather than emotional or heroic ones. This created a kind of intellectual distance from the human costs of military action that made possible unprecedented scales of systematic destruction. When violence becomes a technical problem to be solved through systematic analysis, the moral and emotional constraints that limited earlier forms of warfare begin to weaken. Commanders who think primarily in terms of tactical effectiveness and strategic objectives can authorize levels of destruction that would be psychologically difficult for leaders who conceptualize warfare primarily in personal or heroic terms. This doesn't mean that Iron Age military leaders were necessarily more callous or cruel than their predecessors. It means that the intellectual frameworks they used to think about violence were more abstract, more systematic, and less constrained by immediate emotional responses to human suffering. The development of siege warfare during this period provides a clear example of how scientific approaches to violence could enable unprecedented levels of systematic cruelty. Bronze Age sieges had certainly been brutal, but Iron Age siege techniques showed a level of systematic thoroughness that reflected careful study of how to maximize psychological pressure on defended populations. Roman siege techniques in particular were designed not just to breach enemy defenses, but to create maximum terror and suffering among civilian populations. The systematic use of crucifixion, mass enslavement, and deliberate destruction of agricultural resources reflected analytical approaches to warfare that treated civilian suffering as a tool for achieving military objectives rather than an unfortunate byproduct of necessary violence. By 500 BCE, the transformation was largely complete. Violence had become a science with its own literature, institutions, and professional practitioners. Military effectiveness was no longer primarily a matter of individual heroism or cultural warrior traditions. It was a technical discipline that could be studied, taught, and continuously improved through systematic analysis. This represented a fundamental break with all previous approaches to organized violence. For the first time in human history, societies had developed systematic methods for continuously improving their capacity for destruction. The techniques developed during earlier periods had been refined through practice and experience, but they had never been subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that could generate rapid, sustained innovation. The implications extended far beyond military affairs. The scientific approach to violence created new forms of social organization, new categories of professional expertise, and new relationships between intellectual achievement and political power. Societies that could organize violence scientifically had enormous advantages over those that relied on traditional warrior cultures or heroic leadership. The stage was set for the next phase in the evolution of organized warfare. The emergence of imperial systems that would combine scientific approaches to violence with unprecedented scales of political organization and resource mobilization. The techniques had been developed, the institutional frameworks had been established, and the intellectual foundations had been laid. All that remained was to apply these innovations to the systematic conquest and administration of the known world. The age of scientific warfare was about to become the age of global empire, and when that transformation was complete, The small-scale violence that had characterized earlier periods of human history would seem almost quaint by comparison. Humans had learned to study killing with the same systematic attention they applied to agriculture, mathematics, or astronomy. The only question remaining was what they would do with that terrible the last threshold, when war became forever. By 500 BCE, the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Humans had developed the tools, the techniques, the social structures, and the intellectual frameworks necessary to organize violence on an industrial scale. But there was still one crucial element missing, the idea that war didn't have to end. That conflict could become a permanent feature of human civilization rather than an occasional disruption of it. This wasn't a sudden realization or a dramatic shift in thinking. It emerged gradually from the practical experiences of societies that had become so successful at organizing violence that they couldn't imagine existing without it. Military states that had built their entire political and economic systems around the systematic application of force discovered that peace wasn't just politically difficult, it was existentially threatening. The evidence for this transformation appears in multiple forms across the ancient world. Military expenditures that continue to increase during periods of nominal peace. Professional armies that are maintained at full strength even when there are no immediate external threats. Diplomatic systems that treat warfare as a normal tool of statecraft rather than a last resort when other methods fail. But perhaps most tellingly, we begin to see the emergence of what can only be called military ideologies. Belief systems that don't just justify specific acts of violence, but present organised warfare as a positive good, a necessary feature of healthy societies, a divine mandate that transcends any particular political objective. The Roman Empire provides the clearest example of this transformation in Western civilization. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had become something unprecedented in human history, a society that existed primarily to wage war, not to defend specific territories or achieve particular objectives, but to expand continuously, to consume neighbouring societies, to transform the entire known world into a single military administrative system. Roman expansion wasn't driven by desperate need for resources or territory. The empire had already conquered more wealth and land than it could effectively utilise. Continued warfare wasn't economically necessary. It was politically and psychologically necessary. Roman society had organised itself around the assumption that continuous military expansion was not just beneficial, but essential to its survival as a distinct civilization. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, we see a society that had made war into its primary cultural value, its defining characteristic, its reason for existence. Roman citizens didn't just accept the necessity of occasional military campaigns, they celebrated warfare as the highest expression of Roman virtue and the source of Roman greatness. This wasn't unique to Rome. Across Eurasia, similar transformations were occurring in societies that had successfully organised violence on large scales. The Chinese Empire under the Qin and Han dynasties, the Parthian Empire in Persia, the emerging kingdoms of India, all developed political and cultural systems that treated continuous military expansion as a normal, desirable feature of civilized life. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of this militarization of entire civilizations. Urban planning that prioritizes military functionality over commercial or residential needs. Art and architecture that celebrates conquest and dominance over productivity or cultural achievement. Economic systems that channel enormous resources toward military purposes even during periods of nominal peace. Most significantly, we begin to see evidence of what modern scholars call total war thinking, approaches to military planning that target not just enemy armies but entire enemy societies. The goal wasn't just to defeat opposing forces, but to eliminate opposing cultures, to transform conquered populations into extensions of the conquering society's military system. The Roman treatment of Celtic societies in Gaul provides a clear example of this systematic approach to cultural elimination. Julius Caesar's campaigns weren't designed just to establish Roman political control, but to destroy Celtic social structures, religious practices, and cultural identities. The goal was to transform Gaul from a collection of independent societies into an extension of Roman military power. The human cost of this transformation was enormous. Population studies suggest that Roman expansion resulted in the deaths or enslavement of millions of people across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Entire cultures vanished from the historical record, their languages forgotten, their traditions eliminated, their populations absorbed into Roman military and economic systems. But from the Roman perspective, this wasn't a tragic byproduct of necessary political expansion. It was the desired outcome. Roman ideology treated cultural diversity as a form of political instability that needed to be eliminated for the greater good of universal Roman order. The systematic destruction of local traditions wasn't a failure of Roman civilization, but one of its primary objectives. This represents a crucial turning point in the evolution of organized violence. Earlier societies had certainly engaged in brutal conquest and cultural domination, but they had typically treated such actions as necessary evils or temporary expedients. Roman ideology transformed systematic cultural destruction into a positive moral value, a civilizing mission that justified unlimited expansion and unlimited violence. The psychological implications were profound. Once societies accepted the principle that continuous military expansion was more